Your Excellencies, dear friends, I'm Zeid Al-Hussein, the President of IPI. A good morning to all of you, good afternoon and good evening to our online audience. I'm delighted to welcome you to this policy forum hosted with the permanent mission of Liechtenstein on the legal avenues to fight climate change. The recent climate change conference, COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, saw some significant progress, particularly in the area of loss and damage, which IPI, supporting a very talented ministerial team from the Maldives, had a hand in constructing. And despite this, the overall picture continues to generate considerable anxiety, and we're not doing nearly enough to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And we are still off track to avert the most dangerous consequences of global warming. Indeed, the latest study of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Climate Change 2023 report, brings this point into the sharpest relief. And the UN Secretary General stated recently, climate change is needed, or climate action is needed on all fronts. To accelerate climate action, there's been growing momentum to explore legal avenues to address the climate emergency, and climate litigation is on the rise at the international, regional, and national levels. There are over 2,000 cases now pending. IPI and the permanent mission of Liechtenstein to the UN hosted a policy forum in December 2021 and 4 workshops in 2022 to discuss 4 legal avenues to fight climate change at the international level. The first was a request for an advisory opinion on climate change from the International Court of Justice. The second, a request for an advisory opinion on the impact of climate change on the ocean from the International Tribunal for Law of the Sea. The third, proposals for a new international crime of destroying the environment, or ecocide. And the fourth, the study on the effects of sea level rise on the law of the sea, statehood, and protection of affected persons being undertaken by the United Nations International Law Commission. And we are delighted to note that there's been progress on all these fronts. And yesterday, the result in the General Assembly was rather extraordinary. I would like to begin today's discussion by first asking His Excellency Ambassador Christian Venevesser for some opening remarks. Christian, please.
Thank you so much, Zeid, and thank you all for coming this morning.
Oh, sorry. I should be able to do that myself. In light of the fact that there were, of course, discussions going on nationally, regionally, internationally, to resort to legal avenues, a conversation that we believed was extremely important to also have here, to have an informed discussion on everything, not necessarily because we endorsed all the ideas on the table, but because we thought it was very important to have them, and we're very glad that we did this. So today we will be looking back at what has happened since, and I think it's actually amazing what has happened since. We will hear, of course, on all 4 tracks, 2 of whom, of course, have been initiated now, and the man of the day, of course, is Odo, and the topic du jour is the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice on Climate Change that we passed yesterday by consensus in an extremely important and really historic decision, I believe, for the General Assembly. So I very much look forward to hearing from all the panelists. I really want to thank you, Zeid, and your team for doing this with us. And it's for us not the end of the conversation. There is a lot more work to do. Many in this room have co-sponsored, of course, the resolution yesterday. We have, and the phase of the submissions to the International Court of Justice on the advisory opinion is, of course, just as important as getting the request through. So we very much look forward to working with all of you and with you at IPI on this. A very warm thanks also to all our panelists, especially Kate. Great to see you back, and of course Odo, who are here in person. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Christian. So we now move to our panel discussion. We will first hear from His Excellency Bogdan Orescu, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Romania and member of the United Nations International Law Commission and Professor of Law at the University of Bucharest. After he speaks, we will then listen to His Excellency Ambassador Odo Tevi, permanent representative of Vanuatu to the United Nations. And of course, a big congratulations to him. We look forward to hearing his remarks. We will then hear from Professor Payam Akavan, Professor of International Law at Massey College, University of Toronto, member of the Permanent Court of Arbitration, Counsel to the Commission of Small Island States on Climate Change and International Law on the filing before ITLOS. And finally, last but certainly not least, Professor Kate McIntosh, Executive Director of the Promise Institute for Human Rights of UCLA, and one of the key proponents of the inclusion of the crime of ecocide in the Rome Statute of the ICC. So if we can begin first with the recorded message from His Excellency Bogdan Orescu.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank the International Peace Institute and the Permanent Mission of Liechtenstein to the United Nations for the invitation for me to join this policy forum on legal avenues to fight climate change. It is my great pleasure to address you today as a member of the International Law Commission and as co-chair of the study group on sea level rise in relation to international law, but also as a foreign minister of Romania. As you very well know, sea level rise is a direct negative effect of climate change and presents mounting hazards for human and state security. It has obvious implications on security and stability around the world and creates global problems affecting the international community as a whole. Therefore, it requires global solutions. In this regard, the UN International Law Commission responded to the appeals of the interested member states and promptly included, upon the proposal of the current co-chairs of the study group, myself, Madam Nilufer Oral, Madam Patricia Galvao Teles, Mr. Juan Jose Ruda Santolaria, and Professor Jacuba Sise, the topic sea level rise in relation to international law on the long-term program of work in 2018, and then on its active agenda starting with 2019. Then already in 2020, I co-authored and presented together with my colleague, Professor Nilufer Oral, the first issues paper, focusing on the law of the sea aspects related to sea level rise. This paper generated ample and fruitful debates in the ILC in 2021 and in the Sixth Committee in 2020 and 2021. In 2022, a second issues paper was presented by the other two co-chairs of the study group, being dedicated to statehood and protection of persons affected by sea level rise. It was thoroughly debated last year within the ILC and the Sixth Committee. And currently, Professor Oral and we have finalized an additional paper to the first issues paper. It will be soon published by the International Law Commission, which focuses on certain important aspects related to the law of the sea, thus developing the analysis from the first issues paper of 2020. I will soon get back to the substance of our work inside the ILC, but first I just want to touch upon the wider context of this issue. Sea level rise poses a real risk to over 2/3 of the UN member states, which are likely to be affected either directly or indirectly. This is demonstrated also by the most recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports with regard to the alarming projections of sea level rise. The negative national and international security implications and consequences linked to sea level rise include affecting the coasts, which because of this phenomenon are pushed landward, and therefore affecting the baselines, their actual position being likely impacted by the physical changes of the coast's positioning and configuration, and the maritime zones that are measured from the baselines, the territorial sea, the contiguous zone, the exclusive economic zone, thus threatening the coastal states' entitlements to these areas and the access to the resources therein. The loss of resources on which the littoral populations depend for their sustenance is likely to prompt increased competition over natural resources, and together with the deterioration of living conditions, also to forced migration and displacement of these populations. Sea level rise can also impact the coastal critical infrastructure. And most importantly, it can prompt the loss of state territory. So sea level rise is an existential threat for low-lying coastal states, and especially for small island developing states, which consider their statehood and sovereignty in danger, as their land surface may be totally covered by sea or become fully uninhabitable. It is thus imperative to look into what our options are when dealing with the security implications of sea level rise. So this phenomenon needs at the same time policy changes and legal changes, and I have advocated for a long time now, including in my interventions in the United Nations Security Council last time on the 14th of February, that we need to react quickly and efficiently, including by using all political, legal, and institutional tools provided under the UN framework. Since the state's coasts are the first to be affected by sea level rise, there are at least two options of action to protect the coasts, and thus the state territory, its population, and their rights, the maritime zones, and their resources. In a word, the affected state's interests and rights. One such course of action is to physically protect the coasts through coastal fortifications and consolidation. But this is highly costly, and small island developing states and many low-lying coastal states simply cannot afford these costs. The international community must find innovative instruments to support such efforts. Last September, during the high-level event, Staying Ahead of the Curve, Climate Security and International Law, organized by Germany and Palau in New York in the margins of the General Assembly High-Level Week, I made the proposal of creating an international voluntary fund for this purpose, and I renewed this proposal during the Security Council debate in February. The second option is, of course, to use international law. So what legal solutions can be shaped? Our work in the ILC study group has revealed that, as far as the law of the seas aspects are concerned, it is obvious that for all states affected by sea level rise, the maritime zones established under UNCLOS are central to their economies, to their food security, health, and to their livelihoods. Therefore, the concept of legal stability, security, certainty, and predictability in relation to maritime zones is of paramount importance. The additional paper we have just finalized is focusing inter alia on this essential concept. One option to ensure this much-needed security was already proposed by the co-chairs in the 2020 First Issues paper and endorsed by states from various regions of the world, as evidenced by the submissions to the ILC and by the quite large number of statements presented in the Sixth Committee, but also by the collective regional and cross-regional declarations, such as the August 2021 Declaration on Preserving Maritime Zones in the Face of Climate Change-Related Sea Level Rise of the 18 Pacific Islands Forum members, and the September 2021 Declaration of the 39 heads of state and government of the Alliance of Small Island States. This possible solution refers to the interpretation of UNCLOS that there is no obligation under this treaty to keep baselines and outer limits of maritime zones under review, nor to update charts or lists of geographical coordinates once deposited with the UN Secretary General, and that such maritime zones and the rights and entitlements that flow from them shall continue to apply without reduction, notwithstanding any physical changes prompted by sea level rise. In other words, preserving or fixing or freezing the baselines and outer limits of maritime zones, which is crucial to the legal stability and security, thus allowing for safeguarding the rights of the affected states with respect to their maritime zones. At the same time, as analyzed in the 2020 First Issues paper and in its 2023 additional paper, and supported by the member states in their submissions to the ILC and statements before the Sixth Committee, legal stability and security mean that sea level rise cannot be invoked in accordance with the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties as a fundamental change of circumstances for terminating or withdrawing from a treaty which established a maritime boundary, since maritime boundaries enjoy the same legal regime of stability as any other boundaries. Such possible options are perfectly in line with the need to preserve the integrity of UNCLOS and the balance of rights and obligations included therein. They are also in line with the mandate of the study group, which provides that this ILC topic will not propose modifications to the existing international law, such as UNCLOS. Beyond the law of the sea aspects of sea level rise, another part of the urgent answer to be given by the international community must be to address the increasing humanitarian consequences. As I said before, global solidarity is key here. We have a duty to prevent situations in which vulnerable countries have to choose between responding to climate change and their own development. In order to avoid possible situations of de facto statelessness, we can have in mind a few measures: preserving the fundamental rights and the conservation of the identity of persons that are compelled to settle on the territory of third states because of sea level rise, safeguarding the rights of the affected states with respect to their cultural heritage, preserving the right to self-determination of the affected populations, and enabling through international cooperation the granting of financial and technical support to the affected states when exercising their right to preserve their own existence. The impact on local populations, which is the human face of sea level rise, is already quite visible in the most vulnerable areas. For such populations, solutions should be based on international cooperation between affected states, third states, and international organizations and other relevant stakeholders. Vulnerable groups such as women, children, the elderly, and indigenous populations are likely to suffer the most. It is also crucial to involve local populations in the decision-making process relating to their possible relocation. Also, since territory has long been considered one of the requirements for statehood, the submerging of land poses obvious threats to the territorial integrity of states and even for their existence. This is a novel situation for international law, and the possible legal implications should be assessed accordingly. The 2022 second issues paper, as well as the last year debate dedicated to it in the ILC, examined in detail past or present experiences or situations based on which such legal options might be identified. But the possible international law options are not limited to the ILC work. The advisory opinion already requested in December to the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, and the one just requested yesterday to the International Court of Justice following the initiative of Vanuatu, which was also supported by Romania as member of the core group of states co-sponsoring the General Assembly resolution, which was consensually adopted, and I very much welcome this outcome, can bring more light to the legal implications of climate change, including from the perspective of sea level rise. These are some of the avenues that are being explored or can be further explored in order to identify the most appropriate legal options to deal effectively with sea level rise effects. These endeavors could encourage a higher level of ambition for climate action in the future. Well, at the same time, let me reassure you that as a co-chair of the study group of the ILC on sea level rise in relation to international law, I will continue, together with my colleagues, to work hard on this topic. Next year, an additional paper to the second issues paper will be presented by my colleagues, Patricia Galvao Teles and Juan José Ruda Santolaria, focusing on the protection of persons and statehood as subtopics related to sea level rise. And in 2025, we will present together a final report with concrete proposals. I would also like to reassure you on behalf of my country, Romania, for the full commitment to continue to be part of the global efforts to address the risks that climate change in general and sea level rise in particular pose around the world. And I would like to encourage you to continue to be involved in these efforts, because topical discussions as this one can steer fruitful debates and are extremely valuable. Thank you so much.
Since that was a recorded message, we may have to send a recorded applause back to the minister. We're very thankful for his message. I'm going to suggest a slight change to the order in which we speak, because we are joined by Professor Akavan, who's now in Ukraine, and he can sadly only stay with us for another 25 minutes. So with your permission, Ambassador Tevi, we'll go to Professor Akavan and for an update on ITLOS, and congratulations on the filing, Payam, and the floor is yours. Please, if you would give us an indication of where we stand on ITLOS.
Thank you, Dr. Zeid, and it is a great honor to be invited here. I regret I couldn't be there in person, and I have to join you just briefly from Ukraine, but thank you very much for this invitation. I have to begin on this auspicious day by congratulating Ambassador Tevi and all of his colleagues in the government of Vanuatu for this really feat of epic proportions. Who could have imagined just a few months ago that we would now be poised to request advisory opinions, not just the International Court of Justice, but also from the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. And I'm very pleased that Vanuatu, together with the other members of the core group, the 6 members of COSIS are also part of the core group. And throughout this process of invoking the advisory jurisdiction of these 2 courts, there has been very careful coordination with an emphasis on the complementarity and the mutually reinforcing nature of these 2 proceedings, except that ITLOS was a recipient of the request on December 12th of last year. There is now a time limit of June 16th fixed for the submission of written observations. Several unclosed states parties, as well as international organizations, including the African Union, have expressed their intention to intervene. And it is likely that ITLOS will have a hearing already in September. All this to say that while the ICJ process is unfolding, the ITLOS process will unfold in parallel, and it is likely that we will have an advisory opinion from ITLOS before the ICJ holds hearings. So one of the questions to explore is how the what I would claim is the robust regime on protection of the marine environment in Part 12 is likely to shape the jurisprudence of the ICJ, given the imperative of harmonization between different international courts and tribunals. And it remains to be seen what fruits the ITLOS process will bear, and how that will shape the ICJ's approach towards the questions that are put before it. I would just perhaps make one small observation. As the expression goes, the devil is in the details, in the sense that we would probably agree that we do not want, at the end of this historic process, to simply have a restatement of the obvious principles of international environmental law, whether in respect of due diligence or what have you. Given the enormity of the challenge which climate change represents, in particular for small island states who are the canary in the coal mine of a climate catastrophe, if I may say, I think it is imperative to try and push both of these jurisdictions towards specifying the content of the obligations that states have in respect of climate change. And while I applaud this historic initiative and this incredible opportunity, it may be somewhat disappointing if at the end of the day, we are left with a restatement of abstract principles that don't push us to a more concrete understanding of what states must urgently do in order to effectively address the threat that climate change poses, not just to small island states, but to humankind as a whole. So I will stop there and thank you once again for this kind invitation, and warmest congratulations to Ambassador Tevi and his colleagues.
Thank you, Payam, for giving us this update. And hopefully, before you leave, we'll have a question or two to ask you in specific terms. And now I have the pleasure of handing over the floor to Ambassador Tevi. You have the floor, sir. Odo Tevi.
Well, firstly, let me take this opportunity to thank Zeid for the invitation. Like he mentioned, I was here right at the beginning of last year. I think last year or December 2022. I couldn't remember now. During the start of the discussion of the ICJ. I think the IPI was very, very helpful at the beginning. We had a meeting here and we were discussing the questions. And I was also able to meet my fellow colleagues as well as some of the legal experts. So this has been a fertile ground for the discussion on the advisory opinion. but before that, I had discussions with the Pacific small states, the PCIDS ambassadors. But I think the brainstorming begin here. Now, after our discussion here, there was a lot of discussions with my legal advisors and within my own team. So we have decided to approach some of the ambassadors, but we first started with the ambassadors who attended the IPI meeting discussing the ICJ advisory opinion. So we approached my good friend Christian, and also we approached Germany, who was at the meeting at the time. So we were thinking that they could also help us. So I think this type of meetings are always very important because you do the network, and also you get to know how individuals or certain countries think about a particular situation. Now, before I go into detail about the process, as you may all know, this initiative was led by the youth. They've approached my government, the University of the South Pacific Law students. They approached my government and they requested my government to take this issue to the UN General Assembly. And my government decided to take this up finally, and we took it to the Pacific Island Forum for the leaders to deliberate on this issue. And in their communique in 2019, I think, they have noted the resolution. So the dynamics and also and the landscape was different at the time. Most of the countries were supportive, but some were on the borderline, some were not so supportive. So the youth played a very important role, writing to the governments and asking if they could support this initiative. What happened was COVID slowed down the process, the momentum. So after COVID in Scotland, there was a youth meeting in Scotland. So I was part of the meeting. So we were discussing this initiative. And after that meeting, we had a meeting with the PCIDS and then also the IPI. So what we have decided to do here is we have decided to form a core group. So we started with a small group and then ended up with 18 countries. So our criteria was first to select our friends. So we approached our friends who attended the IPI meeting, but also we selected friends who we think they will provide leadership on climate. So countries like, for example, Costa Rica, who were part of the resolution, the right to a healthy environment. So that was taking place at the same time when the discussions were taking place. So we were also talking to these countries, several countries, and also whether they have the time to support us. But we decided to select a core group of countries that represent other major regions of the world. So Africa, the Pacific, Europe, and Latin America. So it is a microcosm of the UN at the end. And I think the dynamics within the core group itself is very interesting, challenging, sometimes frustrating, but rewarding at the end. It was a very useful experience. It is rewarding. Now, there are two tiers within the core group. So you have the ambassadors, and then you have the expert group. So expert group are mostly lawyers from the missions, from the core group. So they were like the brain trust for this resolution. And then we have our international lawyers. So they were talking to international lawyers and trying to find the language that all the 18 core group members will be supportive of, but also if they take it to the UN membership of the UN, they will be able to maybe accept the language. So that was the challenge. So it's like you playing a monopoly, trying to find whether some countries will be able to agree on certain languages. But the dynamics within the core group also is very important. So the expert group had about 52 meetings. So that was challenging. I can see my staff were sometimes stressful, very, very stressful. But also the core group were also stressed. I think they were tired of hearing one or two calling meetings almost every day. But I believe it's also rewarding for them. But also there is mutual respect between the two. So you have the structure is basically you have the capital who provide the political leadership, and also you have our international lawyers, and then you have the core group, which is central because any resolution, the UN General Assembly resolution is a New York-led process, so it's important to have a core group. And then you have the core group of experts, and then you have the core group of ambassadors. So after every core group of experts meeting, not all core group expert meetings, but after the meetings, then the core group of ambassadors will be discussing strategies, languages, and whether there are some certain disagreements, we'll have to find agreements. And I think I find the experience rewarding, but also I learn a lot from all these interactions. There is one thing as well that you have to make sure that you communicate with the capital almost daily, but also if you have external lawyers, because sometimes here the process at the UN it's quite different but complex, and also it's very difficult to satisfy everybody. We have 193 countries. Some are huge, some are small, some are very, very advanced economies. So they all have different views. And how do we make sure that we have a balanced text? So that was the role of the core group of experts. And they're talking to my lawyers, to our lawyers. But also, I was also asking the lawyers to be innovative and to respect the process here at the UN. And it has to be led and go on by the core group. So I think the core group plays an important role. So they co-lead the movement. So the approach was this resolution, this initiative has to be inclusive and participatory, and all UN member states have to take part. So as a result, we had about 3 informal discussions at the expert level, and then myself and a few other ambassadors, we introduced the resolution right at the beginning. I was quite scared at the time because I thought some major countries may be able to maybe they will be hostile to the resolution, but I was fortunate. But sometimes overthinking doesn't help, but maybe that's human nature. Yeah, so it was inclusive and participatory. So we have decided on the core group, even though we were not all happy, but we decided that this will be the final draft, and then we will start uploading it. So we upload the resolution, and we were aiming for about 80 co-sponsors, and then we ended up around 120, and then yesterday over 130 co-sponsors. So that was a reflection of effective cooperation, as well as solidarity, and also, as well as goodwill. But there's a lot of work behind it. And if you see the resolution, you will find that the whole of the European Union all the EU memberships, they also co-sponsor the resolution. So there's a lot of work behind it. So it is our friends who were the core group members from the European Union. They also play an important role, but also my capital. And then I also have to go to Brussels and discuss the resolution. At the beginning, I mean, they were quite not say skeptical, but they were looking at me and they asked me, "Do you think it will really resolve our challenges?" So we had a long discussions about the rule of law and why it is very important. But eventually, all the EU members supported. But before that, I was skipping some of the process. The CARICOM leaders endorsed the resolution. So the CARICOM leaders and then the ACP, also the Organization of the African Caribbean States, they also endorsed the resolution. But the CARICOM leaders was the first region to endorse the resolution. And then the Pacific Island Forum, they call for a resolution, not endorse, but calling for a resolution. So that language satisfies some of our members within the Pacific Island Forum. But eventually, all the Pacific Island Forum members co-sponsored the resolution. So it's been a long process, but also, like I've said, it's been rewarding. But I think one of the lessons is that personal friendships are very important, personal relationships are very important, and institutes like International Peace Institute plays a very important role, because this is where you start a network, you get to know people, they're few, and you start talking to some of the experts. And sometimes they might not disagree with you, but they also know a lot. So you need to talk to them and discuss the process. And some of them know the UN process very well. So Vanuatu is a very small mission. Before the ICJ, there were only two of us, my secretary and myself. So I am like the boss with no army, general with no army, other mission. And then my government decided that we'll employ other officers. But to increase our capacity, to enhance our capacity, and to make sure that the resolution is successful, we decided to form the core group. So that's how we build our capacity and we take it forward. And they were very helpful. So I think the core group is very important. Collaboration with other member states is very important. Informal is very important. But the informal, in other parts, the AO, because they're concerned about a particular issue. But for this one, it's climate change, so it affects everybody in the world, all countries. So we have to take it to the informals. So I think I will stop here. And if you have any questions, I would be happy to answer. But all I would say is this is just the beginning. We have a second phase, and that is the phase where countries will give the submission, and there will be a lot of coordination. And I want to still keep the core group to continue to inform them about the second phase and how they can be involved. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Tevian. And thank you, Odo, for sharing the details with us, and for you were very kind to IPI. I hope and wish that you remain a permanent representative of Vanuatu for a long time, because my job is not up for an announced vacancy yet. And I'm just, of course, teasing Ambassador Tevi, but thank you for your kind remarks. And now we turn over to Professor Kate McIntosh. Kate, please bring us up to date on where we are with the ecocide.
Yes, and thank you again also from me for the invitation. Very happy to be back. I was here with Ambassador Tevi and a few others discussing these initiatives at the launch of the project. And at that point, we spent more time diving into our proposal and the details of the proposal, but that's not what I'm going to do now. I'm going to talk more about, as suggested by Zeid, where we're going from here and what's happened in the meantime. So this week was Advisory Opinion Week for sure, but it was also the week in which the European Parliament passed a resolution where it's now finalised the text of the new Environmental Crimes Directive, which it's forwarding to the European Commission. And that Environmental Crimes Directive includes both language about ecocide and the requirement that acts that would amount to the crime of ecocide under the panel definition, with some modifications, be criminalised in member states. So that's a really big step forward. It's just the Parliament resolution, of course. The tricky part now is that it goes to the Commission, so all of the member states of the European Union, as you're very well aware. So there's still a lot of work to be done, but that feels like a really big step forward in terms of shifting the conversation and the narrative and the awareness that environmental damage, should be dealt with, first of all, in a criminal framework rather than an administrative framework, which is another thing that this draft directive requires, but also that it can reach the level of an international crime. So I'll just give you a couple of details about that directive for people that are interested in the weeds, and I apologise for those of you who aren't. But the two important features then are, first of all, in the recitals that the directive refers to the international crime of ecocide. So the draft recital number 16 says, when an environmental criminal offence causes severe and widespread, or severe and long-term, or severe and irreversible damage, and that's referring back to the panel definition that we issued in June 2021, to the quality of the air, the quality of the soil, or the quality of the water, or to biodiversity, to ecosystems and functions, or to animals or plants, such offence should be considered a crime of particular gravity and sanctioned as such in accordance with the legal systems of the member states covering ecocide. And then it goes on to say, for which the United Nations are currently working on an official international definition. I don't know if that's actually the case. I mean, it would be great. I don't know if that's on the programme of the International Law Commission quite yet, but maybe this will hasten it along. So ecocide, when it's particularly grave, should be recognised with some elements from our definition. And then I won't read out the way that the directive is phrased, the actual crime, because it appears in a number of paragraphs. But essentially, the directive talks to the EU member states and says, these acts have to be criminalised and not dealt with in an administrative matter. And those acts are the kind of damage that we just heard. Again, they talk about severe and widespread, or severe and long-term, or severe and irreversible. They talk about the offence being unlawful, and they talk about two intention requirements, two mens rea requirements, either intentional, which is a high requirement, or at least serious negligence, which, just for the criminal lawyers or anyone who's been following our definition, is actually a lower requirement than the one that we proposed for the International Criminal Court, which was effectively a recklessness standard. So the EU directive says at least serious negligence. It includes this unlawful definition, and that's interesting as well, because they expand, well, we didn't define unlawful actually in our proposal, but they define it to include unlawful action, includes conduct which is carried out with authorization by a competent authority if the authorization was obtained fraudulently or by corruption, extortion, or coercion, or when the conduct breaches a condition of authorization, obviously. So it's expanded the idea of unlawful to include, corruption, deception, and so on, which I think is a really interesting development, and actually something that we had considered in the panel including, but we decided not to define it in the end. So if this directive is adopted, obviously, all the member states of the European Union would make sure that these acts were criminalized in their national jurisdiction, and that would be an amazing step forward for the protection of the environment for the idea that that destruction of the environment is a criminal offence and not a regulatory offence, and building towards the idea, of course, of an international crime, which was the purpose of our definition on the panel back in 2021. And I think it's interesting to note, my colleague Darryl Robinson, who was actually part of the kickoff meeting, I think, that we had here about the 3 different initiatives, recently published a piece on just security, which he called "The Ecocide Wave is Already Here," pointing to the developments at national level and saying, like, this is where it's going to happen. And I think many of us have thought from the beginning that that would be a very plausible way for things to move, for the crime to move forward at an international level. Obviously, if consensus can be built at national level and agreement on a certain level of activity being seen as a criminal, then it facilitates introduction as an international crime. Since Darryl wrote his blog post, which is on just security, if you want to look it up, this European Parliament resolution has come out, so that's even more the case now. In terms of other states, you may be aware that Belgium has proposed the inclusion of a crime of ecocide in, I don't know if we have anyone from Belgium with us today, but in the revision of their penal code, which is underway. And again, the definition that has been recommended is very close to the definition that we produced in the panel. So I'm delighted about that, because really our aim on the panel when we produced this definition was to come up with something that was credible enough, that was first of all written in the language of international criminal law, which had very much developed since many of the other proposals which have been, have emerged over the years, all very interesting, but they had not had the benefit of the kind of accelerated development of international criminal law, which we've seen in the last 15 years, perhaps. So we wanted to draft a proposal which was in those terms, and which was credible enough to launch a real serious conversation. And I feel like that's happening, and certain elements of the definition are modified. Belgium has modified the mens rea requirement to fit with its own domestic criminal law principles, for example. We see here that the EU actually has modified. They've also took our definitions of the term severe, long-lasting and widespread, almost verbatim, but have removed, for example, we had a reference to cultural resources, which they've moved. So I think that's exactly what we want to see happening, like a serious engagement with the definition that will, improve it, frankly. So yeah, delighted about that. Where do we go from here? I mean, it makes me think of perhaps one downside of the development at national level, which is the potential for divergence, too great divergence in the definition and fracturing of the law, although I take some comfort from the fact that our definition does seem to be framing most of the work, and I hope that would carry on. Another one of the proposals, well, the proposal that Darryl put in his blog post actually was that it would be open to a group of states, not necessarily in a particular regional grouping, to come up with a model law, which would be a way of advancing and developing legal thinking in some kind of coherent way without having to wait for, without the ambitious project of trying to draft an international treaty, for example. But all of this, of course, in parallel to efforts at the International Criminal Court, which we're hoping will also advance. The other point I just wanted to mention briefly is that I think that there is, while we're seeing developments on ecocide specifically at national level, I think there is also a general shift towards this idea of environmental harm being classified as criminal. And I wanted to just flag the recent United for Justice conference in Ukraine, which was looking at accountability for war crimes and aggression, mainly that is being carried out there, and note that there was a panel specifically on environmental crimes, and you'll be aware that there are already a number of international crimes of harming the environment during armed conflict. Actually, there's a specific war crime of harming the environment, but there are also other war crimes which protect civilian property. And the environment is generally considered to be civilian property under international humanitarian law. And this panel was really looking in collaboration with the Ukrainian prosecutors at, how can the environmental damage that's being caused in Ukraine be prosecuted? also both as an international crime, as the war crimes which exist and which Ukraine has in its domestic criminal code, and as the crime of ecocide, which Ukraine also has in its criminal code. Ukraine is one of the former Soviet countries that has the crime of ecocide in its criminal code and has done since the 1990s. So I think the short answer is there are really exciting developments at national level. Obviously, it would be good if there were cross-regional collaborations around this. I think Vanuatu has really been the champion also of the crime of ecocide as an international crime in the statute of the International Criminal Court, which has been wonderful. It would be very positive if some of the European states would join in that initiative. And of course, the broader the coalition, the better. So I'll leave it there and look forward to discussing further.
Well, thank you, Kate, for that sort of update. And first of all, I think we would all like to salute the leadership of all of you on your separate tracks. Given where we were this time last year, or back at the end of 2021, it's clear that we have now we've seen an opening of accounts on all these different tracks, and the momentum is there. We heard from Bogdan that the second issues paper will emerge soon. Those who are preparing themselves and their submissions for ITLOS can hope that there will be a hearing in September. And then, of course, an advisory opinion or the hearings before the ICJ probably will emerge before the end of the year. And then on ecocide, we see a sort of migration of thought into areas of, let's say, the jurisdictions that are not strictly sort of universal, but in the context of the EU will be critical. I suppose the question one has is that listening to Bogdan and Odo and Payam to a certain degree, there is this sort of sense of cohesion of effort in the sense that member states are asking for clarification from authoritative bodies on where the law stands on these issues. And I think the point that needs to be raised is whether there ought to be, or maybe not necessary, a sort of deeper cohesion in the context of what it was that Kate was talking about, the sort of outside inside. So the hope is that if you have clarifications of where international law or law of the sea stands on these issues, it helps with this sort of dialogue within countries, which is where the battle really has to be fought in terms of mitigation and in terms of dealing with vested interests that need to be considered, but need to be also overturned in certain respects when it comes to the energy transition and the need to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees. And I suppose ultimately one has to ask the question of, do we need an active sort of a more active coordination? In other words, in the Netherlands, you had the critical case that was brought by Milieudefensie against Royal Dutch Shell, which was won at the first sort of stage. The appeals, an appeal was lodged. The decision is expected in 2024. And it is a critical case, and the climate change activists stake a lot on the outcome. And so the point really is there a general conditioning? In other words, do we need active coordination between these efforts? Or are we sort of conditioning the environment to the point where such is the anxiety of populations that all of this is sort of each step helps the other? Granted, there is a possibility of fragmentation, but it may be also self-reinforcing, and it may be like a snowball that gathers momentum and gathers in its both in its power and its potential to drive a real consequence here. So I don't know if you would like, it's a rather sort of muddled summation, But if you want to address this point, in other words, do we need more active coordination between these efforts, or let them roll separately because they're all merging in one direction in any case? And maybe the power is in keeping the particles moving at their own strength, at their own speed, and not necessarily forcing a wave function. The wave is coming. You don't have to force it. Or is that perhaps too naive and optimistic about these efforts?
I mean, I would love some way to keep track of everything. That's my feeling. There's so much happening. If we think about the litigation at national level, not just the Shell case you mentioned, but there's so much happening. And then, of course, the field of human rights, which you also mentioned, Ambassador, and the developments there, and the number of expert mechanisms or committee decisions that are coming out in the human rights field about the environment. So I do like the thought of something that can ensure that these things are being coordinated. I think at the moment it's different individuals. I mean, I have to say that I think two very important players in the coordination so far are sitting next to me. I mean, I think IPI, having hosted this series of talks, was exactly that, and really models, what that might be like and how that might be useful. And then genuinely, Ambassador Tevi is himself at the center of, a number of these initiatives. So Vanuatu as a state seems to be almost the meeting point of a number of these, and of course other supporters who are here today as well. So it seems like a very big project to try and coordinate everything in the way that I find it's quite a big project on a personal level to try and, manage to keep on top of everything that's happening. But it must be a good idea. So I don't know what it looks like, but I think it should be attempted.
But I think it's interesting to imagine that if we're at chapter 1 of the story, what chapters 2 and 3 would look like. Yeah. And we've gone through the introduction, and one of the central authors is you, Odo. You're sort of creating a spearhead when it comes to this. But is there, if you emerge with two good opinions from ITLOS and ICJ, and the appeals decision is decisive in the case of Royal Dutch Shell, for example, then where do we go from there? I mean, one has to be hopeful, and the warning signs are there. The publics are seized by it. We still have a lot of people who don't quite realize how their lives may need to change, not necessarily worse, but they will need to change in the 21st century. So all of this would seem to point to something happening in chapter 2 and chapter 3. We don't quite know what it is, but there is a momentum, I think, clearly. Yeah. And you've pointed to it from where we were last year to where we are now, with a consensus decision in the General Assembly. It's quite extraordinary.
Yeah. Well, I mean, these are like 3 mountains. Some are very high mountains. Some are not too high because you don't have to go to the General Assembly. But the ICJ is one of the mountains that we have to climb with a core group and try and coordinate. So climbing this mountain was quite challenging. But at the end, after the adoption, it becomes a hill, a flat land. But that is through a spirit of working together. I think that's very important, but it's a lot of work. So I think first we need to coordinate. I think that's very important. When I was in Glasgow, I was there and my government was talking about the ICJ initiative. And then Antigua and Barbuda, they signed a separate agreement on the ITLOS initiative. So our view then was, wow, this is taking place at the same time that we are discussing our initiative. So we need to coordinate. How do we talk to them? So Vanuatu has decided to be part of the courses. So we are a member of the courses, and we are discussing the questions with them. But when we were in Scotland, we also had the opportunity to meet PIAM and emphasizing the need to coordinate. So I think this is very important, but also to recognize the different jurisdictions. So, for example, ITLOS is more focused on the law of the sea, whereas the ICJ it's even more broader. It covers the law of the sea as well, but it's even more broader. So the questions that we should be crafting, we have to ensure that it will be answered by a relevant body. So they are working with each other. Our lawyers are working with each other, but also Vanuatu is part of the ITLOS initiative, as well as leading the ICJ initiative. So I think that's very important when it comes to the question. But they all have different challenges. Like the ICJ initiative has a different challenge to ITLOS, because ITLOS you just take it to the court, whereas the ICJ you have to go to the General Assembly, and the questions could be watered down. So that's the challenge for the core group, as well as for my government. So I think that's the challenge. Now with Ecoside, it's more independent, but we are working together with them. I think that's very important. But like Kate was saying, an institute like an IPI, I mean, regular discussions will be very important. Facilitating regular discussions and find ways that these initiatives can be able to work together. So on your question, it can be a bit of both. It can develop naturally independent. But what I find, like you mentioned about the consensus yesterday, that there's a lot of goodwill out there. And countries are trying to do good things. And I think it's very important. But also I find that they have to participate in it. You have to continue to engage with these countries. If we don't engage with countries, it will be very hard to sell the product. So I think that's very important. Thank you.
And you touch on a critical point that I think all of us who are working for governments or have worked for governments fully recognize, that to a certain extent, we are very good at working on international agreements or developing treaties or coming to an agreement on a resolution. We are particularly skilled at doing that. The critical problem is how governments organize themselves and their priorities such that the weight and authority of an international decision comes through the foreign ministry, through the Ministry of Justice, through the prime ministry, through the president's office, and then can permeate through the rest of the government. When you have fisheries, forestry, trade unions, ministries of interior, the security angle, rural affairs, and all of them have opinions which are not necessarily aligned with the international standard emerging. And it's there where the battle has to be fought the hardest, because what we tend to see is that if it isn't, then we go back outside again and think, okay, we need a protocol because this agreement isn't going anywhere. Now we need to negotiate a new agreement. And so in part, it's, I think, the bringing together all these efforts, but maybe loosely, sort of a gentle nudging where internally it's recognized that there's so much external pressure, and there's a pressure emerging from within countries that things must change. Principally, a way of life that was based on carbon needs to change to something else, but not necessarily worse. Yeah. And I think it's that battle inside of states which is the critical area that we need to change. And I hope that it's one that can be won. But I think at an international level, we're pretty good at what it is that we do. And you've demonstrated this enormous skill, Odo, and all kudos to you, really, for an amazing work you've done together with the team, together with Ambassador Christian Beneves and the core group, many of whom are represented here. It's how we convert it to sort of change and alignments of domestic priorities that I think is the critical issue. And I could see Kate nodding.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. Like in my country, we have coalition governments. So each parties may have different views about certain policies. So that's quite challenging. So you have to navigate through that and making sure that they all have a one voice or bipartisan there. But also, when we were taking the resolution within the core group itself, the dynamics, you send the resolution, and we all have different processes in the country. So some of the countries, they have to go through different ministries, and it will take time. And we were planning maybe December, we will take it to the General Assembly. We ended up in March, but that's also because of possible budgetary implications that we were considering. But these are the dynamics that you have to navigate, the external as well as within, how countries they view this, but different ministries, different departments. So that's the challenge, especially for major countries. It's not that easy.
Can I add something? Yeah, I think that's really, I like the talking about the inside outside, and I think you touched on something really relevant, which is that, as we all know, there are really strong popular movements in support of all of this. I mean, in all of our countries, and Ambassador Tevi spoke about how the initiative came from students in your country for the advisory opinion, but of course there are climate activists everywhere, and I think it's got to be probably one of the most useful things we can do is to ensure that the voices of people being affected on the front lines are heard in these kind of policy fora that are taking place sort of here and in the situations you're talking about, drafting international agreements. And I think, so I'm coming from a university, that's a role that we can play perhaps, for example, in terms of hosting, trying to connect activist groups and populations who are at the front of the impacts of climate change and so on with the policymakers. And we actually held a little, this isn't meant to be an advert, but I'm just thinking on the 11th of March, we actually had a forum where we invited some of the UN Special Procedures mandate holders, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and then activists from across the Americas to speak about their experiences of climate change. So sort of mixing the expertise. So the expertise and analysis of people who are actually we're all affected by climate change. I mean, we're all these people, but some more than others. So people who are already campaigning for their own, immediate situation, bringing that expertise together with the diplomats and international lawyers and human rights activists more broadly. And I think that's an important piece to hold on to in this coordination.
And there is, notwithstanding the latest report by IPCC, there is a sense of occasion that something ought to, perhaps should, perhaps will happen this year. We have the spring sessions of the international financial institutions very close at hand. They're within 10 days' time. There's a momentum that has come out of the COP to address matters of finance. There are initiatives, a Bridgetown initiative launched by Prime Minister Mia Mottley in terms of thinking innovatively about financing, not just climate, but how you settle debt. The new or incoming president of the World Bank seems to be completely inclined to thinking in a way that's innovative about what the World Bank would be prepared to do. The G20 has mobilized and produced a set of recommendations. And all of this seems to suggest that something ought to happen. But the vested interests that you spoke of are there still, operating silently, not easy to overturn them. Most governments are very aware of how powerful these lobbies and groups are. There is a sympathy and an understanding that climate change can be, entirely existential for humankind, but the preparedness to sacrifice first is not quite there. And each, segment of a particular industry will say, not us first before transportation. Let's have the oil and gas industry start first, and then transportation later, or whatever the the sort of combination of this is going to be. So I'd like to turn over to Ambassador Christian Benevesser, please, and let's have questions from the floor.
Yeah, just a thought prompted really about what Kate has said in particular, because she said keeping track of what's going on. I mean, I think there is a bit of a market for a project that would do that, because there's going to be a lot as far as legal avenues and, also far beyond the 4 topics we have discussed today. So there's stuff in the European Court of Human Rights and elsewhere. So I think it would be very interesting to have a dedicated project that just keeps everybody updated on what's going on. Of course, that does require dedicated staff and also funding, but I think it would be worth thinking about that. This is not coordination, of course. This is just information sharing, but I think that will be key for us. Honestly, it's impossible to keep track of everything that goes on. On coordination, I would think, especially I think that the projects in a way are very different. So on the ICJ submissions, I think it's very important to coordinate submission reflections, and I hope we will do that very soon. On the NECO side, it would probably be very good to have, the states that are nationally interested coordinate also about, on definitions, because if the same definition is used in many national systems, that makes it much different to then maybe at some later stage go to a different level.
Christian, you've suggested a new line of work for us. I have to look at Adam Lepel's sort of facial expressions to see whether this is something we can undertake, but we will give serious thought to it. So thank you. One of the issues we haven't discussed, Kate, is the impact on biodiversity. COP15 was a very interesting development. A new set of goals emerged as a sort of resolution on biodiversity, which seems to suggest that the climate change agenda and biodiversity is coming together. When trying to develop within a criminal code an understanding of what would constitute severe harm to the environment, would you consider, for instance, the IUCN and the International Union for the Conservation of Nature's Red List, the list where endangered species of flora and fauna are being placed, as a trigger for that form of jurisdictional regime? That once you're on that red list as a species, then there could be a jurisdictional trigger when it comes to extreme impact on the human rights of those affected by climate change, but also biodiversity, which is intimately linked to our enjoyment of rights.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like I could have placed that question with you beforehand, but I definitely didn't, because I've actually just written an article about this with Olivia Swart-Goldman from the Wildlife Justice Commission about the application of our definition to wildlife crime. And exactly, I think what we looked at was how the definition of severe, when wildlife crime might meet the definition of severe, and certainly threats of extinction, I think would fall squarely into that category. So I think in practice, that list would prove very effective. And I absolutely agree with your kind of broader point that if we're thinking about, well, the ecocide definition is not targeting climate change in particular. And in fact, that's the most difficult environmental destruction to get at with that. It actually, wildlife crime or reduction of biodiversity is a lot more straightforward.
Yeah.
I mean, deforestation would also be straightforward, which of course would lead to climate change. But yeah, I think that's a crucial element.
And would you give a scope to the idea that a government would have the space allowed it to arrest the destruction and to change? In other words, if it's unwilling or incapable of that, the jurisdictional trigger would be tripped.
Oh, I see what you mean. So, like, would a crime still have been committed if remedial actions were taken off?
That's right. So once the species is on the red list, for example, that within a certain space of time, a government has to ensure the protection of that species, even if it's contributed to, in part, the destruction of it beforehand. And then if not, then you would have, we'll we're musing over how this would work.
Yeah.
But I think it would be something like that.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. We actually had thought about, when we were developing the definition, we'd thought about a different sort of formulation of the crime, which actually would have a kind of introduction period, which is exactly the kind of thing you're proposing, but more generally, of more general application, actually, with the idea that obviously the point of introducing the crime is prevention. So that, governments would be on notice with the introduction of the crime that, they had to get their house in order to a certain extent by then. We didn't include that in the end, but I think it's still a really interesting proposal, and might be more attractive to states as well.
And perhaps if I can turn to you, Odo, again, because it's now been said a few times this morning that you are at this fulcrum of activity, and for a state like Vanuatu, you, I think, are better placed than most to see a convergence of all of this. The Ocean Conference sort of track, the concern about the marine environment, and now the high seas. Of course, the treaty was just adopted a few weeks ago. And then you have the destruction of biodiversity, which is severe, including marine wildlife. And you have the effects of rising sea level, and then 2 devastating hurricanes, Category 4 hurricanes, in only a few weeks, affecting Vanuatu. But do you see a convergence of these initiatives where you're not having just COP in one instance, and then you have the biodiversity, the CBD COP, and then you have the Oceans Conference, but it's almost, it needs to be an integration of all of it. It's one planet, one life for us, one chance, essentially. Does that make sense, or is it too prodigious an amount of work for people to handle when it's sort of integrated like that?
Well, when you think about it, it's a huge challenge in terms of coordinating and working with all these different initiatives. But I think we have to find innovative ways to integrate them. I think that's very important. But we have to be clear on what this initiative means. Some of them could be distinct, even though there could be some link in between, because they're talking about climate change, the environment, and they're linked to biodiversity. I think that's very important. But I mean, and there are cross-cutting issues like climate change, which in all these topics, you can also include the impacts of climate change. And also you can draw in human rights aspect into the discussion. So I think you've got to have a place or an institution where you can have the convening power. So I think the UN is a natural place, but sometimes it could be hostile. But also you could have neutral venues where you can come together and discuss it. But also a particular group of countries that are well respected. I think that's also very important. So it is a very important question that you've been asking there, a plethora of initiatives, and how do we make sure that we work together and drive this forward. There are certain ways to do it. I think the UN would be a natural place for this type of discussions, but also a place like IPI or universities. I think that's also very important, or nations which are smaller or larger, but they have a reputation. I think that's very important. I'm not sure whether I directly answer your question, because it is a question that you have to think about, or even write an essay, maybe, or ask a ChatGPT about it.
No, I wouldn't ask them about it, but it's almost like you have an orchestra in the making. The string section is coming together, and it's been working for 27 years, but isn't part of a wider orchestra. The woodwinds 15 years, and it's almost like a conductor is needed, no? To sort of tie in all these different legal regimes, these different but connected aspects of the human experience. So please, sir.
Thank you. I have a question relating to the advisory opinion proceedings. Thank you. It seems to be...
Could you introduce
Forgive me. My name is Eirik Bjorge. I'm a law professor. I'm currently at NYU. And my question is this. It seems to me, on the one hand, to be important to procure decisions from ITLOS and the ICJ, which are effective, which are punchy, which are strong. On the other hand, it seems also to be important to get decisions from those two bodies which command a great majority within the tribunal, within the court, so that they can be effectively used in the next stages. And what sort of thinking should we be engaging in as regards striking the right balance? One doesn't want to water down submissions before the court, I don't think. On the other hand, some thinking needs to go into how to get something like a unanimous court, tribunal, or something very close to it. I know that the moderator has direct experience of advisory proceedings before the ICJ in the past. Some of the most effective advisory opinions have been very close to unanimous. Would there be any thoughts as to this?
No, I mean, clearly you're touching on a critical point, and the more it looks like it's unanimous, and if you didn't have strong dissenting opinions, that it would carry more weight. I could clearly see, for example, before the appeals decision is undertaken with respect to Milieu Defensive versus Royal Dutch Shell, that an amicus brief would be filed reflecting the decisions or the advisory opinions. And if they're strong, it may have an effect. And so I think you're on point. Judges can be notoriously unpredictable, as we all know. I think if the submissions, and Ambassador Tevi has spoken to this, and Ambassador Venevesser as well, if the coordination is done well and the arguments are deep and persuasive, there's no doubting that judges can be affected by it. But courts are courts, and so there's always this possibility of a dissenting opinion with some power. And I think all the more reason for member states to ensure that they continue now with their participation in the submissions and in the oral submissions as well. So I don't know if you would like to add anything.
Yeah, I think you mentioned, I think that the submissions will be very important, but also that the legal questions that you will be asking the court, it's also very important. So for this resolution, I mean, it's adopted by consensus, so you have the weight of the General Assembly. So one would hope that the judges will look at this. But there are also other factors that you have to consider. In my country, judges are appointed and they're for a lifetime. But the International Court of Justice judges are elected. So it's quite a political process to elect a judge. So they have their own views on certain issues because states are electing them. So there will be election maybe in June, if I recall correctly, 6 judges. So this will have an impact on an advisory opinion, but we hope that member states can elect wisely. Yeah, so in some of our discussions, we were looking at different judges and their record on human rights, the environment, how do they make judgments or their views on these areas. And I mean, some of the judges are former PR, some of our colleagues here at the UN, so we know their views. So, I mean, these are challenging, but also for small states like Vanuatu, where we are now taking this issue, and I'm sure countries like Palestine also, they're taking the issue to the International Court of Justice. International Court judges will be very important, and choosing them will be very important. For small states, it will be about climate change, the environment. So we'll be asking more of these questions. And if the judges can be able, or the candidates can be able to answer some of this. So it sort of pushes us to do the right things as well, but to elect good judges as well. But I mean, it's something for the member states to consider, and they have the sovereign rights to do so.
Yeah. Thank you.
I could just add that we had, of course, the same tension when proposing the draft of ecocide. So in the panel, there were lots of discussions about, well, we should go this way because this is what states will like, but that's not going to protect the environment enough, the threshold. And there were many compromises actually among the group. So I think that's probably always the case. I'm thinking about the work on the crime of aggression. I think that's certainly, struggle with the same issues.
We've reached now the end of our time. Before we do so, I had two questions, which I have to say, I apologize I hadn't seen earlier, but I hope we've addressed in the context of the discussion. One is from my old friend, Shazia Rafi, who asks about the connections between court cases at national levels on climate change, air pollution by individuals and communities, and governments, corporations with these legal avenues. And we tried to address that. So thank you, Shazia, for asking. And an anonymous question, or a question from an anonymous viewer about can the right to adequate housing and the right to an adequate standard of living be used to protect people, their housing and livelihoods when it comes to international law protecting individuals and families that would be negatively affected. I think certainly there's a lot of litigation on this issue, specific issue in the cases that have been filed in the US, in Australia, in the European Union context. And that may have an effect in the broader interpretation of international law. I think this is to be determined. I want to now thank our distinguished panelists, and particularly, of course, those who've remained with us, but we also thank His Excellency, the Foreign Minister of Romania, Bogdan Oroscu, for having spoken to us, and for Payam Akavan for speaking to us from Ukraine about ITLOS, but also most particularly Ambassador Odo Tevi of Vanuatu for giving us a brilliant account on the development of the process that led to the advisory opinion request by the General Assembly. We wish you the best of luck and all power to your elbow. And thank you, Professor Kate McIntosh, for illuminating us as to where your initiative is heading and what may possibly come out of it. We wish all of you the best of luck. This is supposed to be the final of this series. I'm not sure, listening to Christian, that it will end here, because if we're only at chapter 1, there are going to be other chapters, and perhaps we'll call you back to join us again. But if you could give me, if you could give a round of applause to the distinguished panelists. And thank you for joining us this morning. We're delighted to have you here.